Back in August of 2021, there was a massive NetSuite outage. It affected a massive amount of MuleSoft APIs for a company I was working at. Any type of read or write to NetSuite using their SOAP APIs was failing. All the sales operations had come to a standstill. It was my job to figure out what was happening, why, and how I could rectify the situation. In this video, I'm going to walk you through that day and how we got through it. NetSuite is an ERP financing system that MuleSoft has a connector to talk to its APIs. You can easily add it on the right side here, and then you can get all the operations to it. Sometimes the icon will look a little different if you're using a different version. To take it a step back, an ERP system stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. It refers to a type of software that organizations use to manage day-to-day business activities such as accounting, procurement, project management, risk and compliance, and supply chain operations. To simplify that, it hosts orders, customers, payments, invoices, so the day-to-day accounting, and then the business with that information in there can run reports on sales, on their planning, on reports for financing, for auditing reports. But in terms of MuleSoft, what we try to do is getting the data in and out of that system so that the business can use that data efficiently. So NetSuite has a popular one. This page here, Oracle, they have a product. Oracle Fusion Cloud ERP. SAP is an ERP. And because the NetSuite ERP is so popular, we clearly weren't the only ones affected by this outage. To explain what happened, we need to understand what are the web service requests that MuleSoft is making to NetSuite. And we'll see this in action when we run the sample MuleSoft application that I built. If you start up your MuleSoft application and you're using the NetSuite connector, there are two calls that get made as the server is starting up. The first one is a SOAP request to webservices.netsuite.com with the action to get data center URLs, which gets back a set of URLs, and then it uses those URLs, for example, this top line right here, in subsequent calls, which is the next one, to get server time. And then after the server started, well, there'll be other calls. So my example, I'm doing a get order by ID, but all subsequent calls are during the normal running of your process. On that outage day, it was really tricky to figure out what was going on. When we went into the logs for the NetSuite System API, we could see that one of the worker number 1, was still successfully making calls to NetSuite, but worker number 2 was getting back an error every time it tried to communicate. So it wasn't a complete outage, and it really puzzled me as to why one worker would work, but one wouldn't. My first thought was, oh, one of the workers is bad, the second one's working, let me refresh the server. Unfortunately, what happened is when the server refreshed, both workers stopped working after that. So I made a problem that was only affecting 50% of the business now affect 100% of the business. After digging in more into the actual error message coming back from NetSuite, it seemed like it was this get data center URLs API request that was failing. And this data center URL wasn't getting called with every single request. So I really had to figure out what does this request actually do, because I'm not specifically calling it in my MuleSoft application. After Google searching, I realized what I kind of explained before. It's a REST service to discover account-specific domains for the following. So SOAP request, RESTlet request, and your system domain. Let me show you what a successful response to this web service looks like. There are 3 URLs that come back. You'll see this is the account ID for NetSuite, and then the restlets.api.com, a suitetalk.api.netsuite.com, and then an app.netsuite.com. And you can see this is the REST domain, this is the web service domain, and this is the system domain. On this flow here, this is just the NetSuite connector that does all web service SOAP requests. In NetSuite, there's also a concept of a scriptlet that you can invoke from your MuleSoft application. That's a separate module that you download. It's called a NetSuite RESTlet. And those two send requests to different domains. So the one that we're using in our MuleSoft flow we'll call the sweettalk.api.com. But if we wanted to invoke a RESTlet, we'd have to use a different domain account at restlet.api.netsuite.com. And for some reason, you can't hard code these URLs inside your connector. You have to make a specific request out to NetSuite, and they'll give you them, and then the connector will store them for subsequent requests. My guess, this is NetSuite's solution to roll out a new suite of APIs on a different domain and still be backwards compatible. But this is just a guess. So once I understood more about this get data center URLs, the picture started getting a little bit clearer. When you get these domains, they're not going to switch very often, so you don't have to make a call before every request to NetSuite. That's when I recognized the pattern that on server startup, the connector was making a request. And then from checking the logs, it looked like every once in a while, the request would be made again. So the fact that it was only affecting one worker made sense now, because worker 1 hadn't gone to refresh the data center URLs by making a call out yet. But worker 2 had, it had failed, and then all subsequent requests on worker 2 were failing, but worker 1 was still going. But when I restarted the server, the cache that was holding the data center URLs gets wiped out, and now they need to make a new request on startup. So now worker 1 and worker 2 on startup, when I restarted the server, went out to get the URLs. They both failed, and now the whole application was failing. So my next course of action was to see if I could reproduce the issue. So I went into my Anypoint Studio, fired up my NetSuite SAPI application, ran it through debug mode with wire logging turned on so I can see the actual payload requests going to NetSuite or not. And on server startup, I could see the request going out for the data center URL, but it was failing, and even locally I wasn't able to get any requests successful to NetSuite. But what this allowed me to do is, because I had wire debugging turned on, I was able to go into my console and get the exact request going to NetSuite. And this is what it looked like. So I had the XML envelope body, and I had all the headers. So I tried to isolate this, and I went into SOAP UI, had to download the WSDL from a site at NetSuite, but I replicated this request exactly, and it was successful, which really blew my mind. It wasn't like I was doing anything wrong in code, because it's all behind the scenes anyways. All I could do was configure the global XML configuration properties. It was only like 6 settings, and they had previously working for over a year with no issues. At the end, I'll explain why it worked through SOAP UI and not my MuleSoft application. But for now, I didn't know what to do. Ideally, if the MuleSoft connector had a spot where I could enter these data center URLs, maybe like an override, we wouldn't have an issue. I can't just submit a ticket to MuleSoft and wait for them to update the connector. The whole business was pinging me nonstop. So I needed a way to get these data center URLs into my application so that subsequent calls can use the correct domain name, so my application can go back to reading and writing to NetSuite. And that's when I had this idea. Running it through SOAP UI, and admittedly on our production server we had debug logging turned on, I could get the actual response that was needed from this request. And as I showed before, it looked like this. It just had the 3 URLs that needed to be returned, and these never changed. There was nothing time sensitive about this. If I could get this SOAP envelope to respond to the API, then the NetSuite connector can store the values and continue on processing further requests. So my plan of action was to create this architecture. Whenever MuleSoft would send a request to NetSuite, I needed a proxy in the middle that would see if it was trying to access the get data center URLs. If it did, let's hard code the response back to MuleSoft. And if it wasn't, if it was any other request, let's continue to pass it on to NetSuite. The great thing about this is the MuleSoft connector supports proxies. Inside the NetSuite config, there's a tab called Proxy, a proxy server that stands in the middle of your two applications, and then all requests to NetSuite will be redirected to this host and port. So I went searching online for a quick mocking service, and I downloaded one to my local machine called HTTP Toolkit. What I was looking for is not specifically a browser. I was looking for outbound traffic on my whole machine. And they had this option called anything. So as long as I had this running, I now have a proxy at this web address. So I took these settings, localhost at port 8000, and because it was HTTP and my requests to NetSuite are over HTTPS, I could either do one of two options. I could either download the certificate from netsuite.com, or I could just set it in my TLS configuration to ignore the invalid certificate or error not being found inside the key store. Again, this was just a proof of concept, so this was the quickest way to get through that error. I now had to define which requests were going to be mocked and which ones were going to be let through. And that's where they had this section where you can create your mocking rules. Because I had the outbound request, my rule would be if the URL is /services/NetSuite port and the action is get data center URLs, which I did here. And then I took this response body as XML, plopped it into my mock response body, and hit saved. And now all I had to do was go to my view, and hopefully I could see the requests from MuleSoft going through here first before hitting NetSuite. Let's see it in action. So I have my MuleSoft application where all it does is it's on a scheduler just so it's an easy to trigger. Has a logger, has a simple request that looks for a sales order inside NetSuite. And then it looks up that sales order ID using the connector and then just exits out. So if I run this, let's do it as debug mode. The server is started now. And you can see there's already been a few outbound HTTP requests. And that's what I was mentioning before, how those get data center URLs is first called on startup. So what we're hoping to see is the response for this outbound request is coming from our mocking service. So here's the post, and here's the response, and it was a 200 OK. So let's see if this response came from our mocking service. Yes, our mocking service has picked up two requests. The first one was a post for a get data centers URL, and it aborted it, so it successfully caught it, which is great, exactly what we needed. And the second one was a request for the SOAP action get server time, as we mentioned was the second HTTP request it makes on startup. But this one actually went through, so it passed it all the way to NetSuite, gave a response body, and came back as 200 OK. The fact that we were able to make that second get time request validates that our mock request results was picked up by the connector, parsed successfully, and used in the subsequent calls. But the business validation is that we can still get data in and out of NetSuite. So let's step through this flow to see if we can pull out this sales order. And we were. No errors. And we got back our web service XML with the sales order. So that's awesome. We were able to identify what the issue was. We were able to create a mocking service, and we're able now to write and read data from NetSuite. So the question is, what do we do with this information? What are our options, and how do we get the business running again? Option number one, the HTTP toolkit is a downloaded product to my Windows machine. I have that. I could run that mocking service on my machine, open up my firewall, so I'll have an external IP address, and then inside my MuleSoft applications, put that external IP address inside my NetSuite connector code in that proxy section. I'll have to do a little bit of port mapping on my firewall, but it's not a big deal. A pro of this is the data is going through my work computer. However, my computer is definitely not as secure as MuleSoft Cloud Hub. And also, this isn't a long-term option, as clearing all our operations will be dependent on my laptop never shutting off or having any power issues. Option number 2 is instead of buying a mocking service that's a download, if I could find one online that's cloud-based. So that way we can go from MuleSoft AWS to this service in the cloud to NetSuite in the cloud. Pros of this is definitely going to be more stable than running it on my local machine. However, we are now moving data into an unknown vendor that hasn't properly been vetted and onboarded. Definitely possible, but it would take longer to set up than step 1. Or step number 3 is I build a similar functionality inside MuleSoft. So a simple mocking service that checks for URLs, and depending if it's a match or not, I either pass it on to NetSuite or I mock them. Because I'd be building this from scratch, it would definitely take the longest to implement. So I brought these 3 options back to the business and discussed which one they wanted to do. And at every organization, the response may be different. But we were in a situation where it was Friday afternoon. There was only a few sales orders that needed to be done right away so that they could be shipped out before the deadline. But then on Saturday and Sunday, there was no orders being take place anyways. And on the side, which I didn't mention, is after I did find out about what was happening, we actually had a meeting with NetSuite and their engineers, and I showed them what was happening through MuleSoft and how it was working through SOAP UI, but not through my MuleSoft application. And they were actively coming up with a fix. So what we ended up doing is just placing a few last orders through my local machine using Postman to call the MuleSoft system API to get those orders through. And then we were just hoping that over the weekend, NetSuite would be able to resolve the issue. And luckily enough, they were. They got it working on Sunday so that when we opened for business on Monday, all NetSuite applications were back running without any code changes needed. And they came back and told us that they had made an update to their code that had broke the streaming capabilities to read API requests for that get data center URLs. So what was happening is MuleSoft was streaming that request to them. It was failing, but when I was going through SOAP UI, it was a single request going through. There was no streaming. But no harm, no foul to our organization. I'm not sure if anyone else got hit with this issue. But it was a crazy Friday trying to figure this all out, and then Saturday and Sunday just seeing how we were going to start working on Monday. So thank you everyone for listening to my story. I have plenty more if you want to hear them. If you do, let me know in the comments section, or if you have any questions, let me know there as well. If you like this video, please hit a thumbs up, and if you're interested in more videos on MuleSoft technologies, please make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Peace.